The knife moved by itself. Chiamaka watched, her small fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, as the sharp blade lifted slowly from the wooden block. It hung in the air, spinning slowly like a compass needle, searching for true north. Her mother, Funmilayo, continued washing dishes, humming to herself, completely unaware of the danger just feet away. It was 11:47 at night. Chiamaka was not the same girl who had left for school that morning. Something had changed. Something dark had entered her life, and her family had no idea. 3 days earlier, everything had been normal. Or as normal as life could be for a 12-year-old girl whose parents barely noticed her existence. Adebayo, her father, was a Lagos businessman who left home before sunrise and returned after midnight. His work consumed him, phone calls, meetings, constant travel. Some weeks, Chiamaka saw him for less than an hour total. Her mother, Funmilayo, ran a busy medical clinic in the city center. She would leave early, dressed in crisp white medical coats, her medical bag packed with tools and urgency. She would return late, exhausted, with just enough energy to ask Chiamaka about her homework before falling asleep. Chiamaka was what adults called a responsible child. She made her own breakfast, packed her own lunch, walked to school alone, returned home alone, did her homework alone. Prepared her own dinner from leftovers in the refrigerator. Alone. Always alone. St. Margaret's Secondary School was not kind to invisible children. The school stood at the edge of their Lagos neighborhood, a concrete building with faded blue paint and rusty metal gates. Children from rich families dominated the playground. They arrived in clean cars, wore expensive uniforms, carried fancy water bottles and lunch boxes. Chiamaka's uniform was always clean, but it was clearly secondhand. Her shoes were worn. Her school bag had been her older cousin's, with faded cartoon characters peeling off the sides. She didn't have friends, not really. The other children either ignored her or looked right through her. During break times, she would sit alone under a mango tree, eating her simple packed lunch, watching other children laugh and play. That day started like any other. Hot, dusty, loud. But everything was about to change. The group of older girls approached her during lunch break. They were Form 3 students, much older and cooler than Chiamaka's Form 1 class. Their uniforms were pressed, their shoes shiny, their hair perfectly braided. "Hello, Chiamaka," said the tallest girl, Rebecca. Her smile was too sweet, her eyes didn't match her smile. Chiamaka looked up, surprised. These girls had never spoken to her before. "We have something for you," said another girl, Mary, pulling out a small chocolate wrapped in golden foil. The chocolate looked expensive, not like the cheap ones sold by street vendors. This looked like the kind of chocolate her father might bring from his international trips. "For me?" Chiamaka's voice was small, unsure. "Yes, just for you," Rebecca said, her smile growing wider. Chiamaka's hand trembled as she took the chocolate, her small fingers feeling the smooth golden wrapper. The mango tree above her cast dappled shadows on the dusty schoolyard, its leaves whispering secrets in the warm Lagos breeze. She had never been given anything by the older girls before, and suspicion warred with longing in her heart. "Go on," Mary urged, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes glinting with an emotion Chiamaka couldn't quite name. "Eat it." The world around Chiamaka seemed to blur at the edges, the laughter and shouts of other children fading into a distant hum. The chocolate in her hand felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of unseen consequences. Slowly, reverently, she unwrapped the treat. The smell that wafted up was unlike any chocolate she had ever known. Sweet, yes, but with an undercurrent of something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong in the ordinary world of school uniforms and textbooks. One bite. That was all it took. The chocolate melted on her tongue, a cascade of flavors flooding her senses. Sweet warmth spread through her mouth, but beneath it lurked a taste she couldn't identify. It was old, impossibly old, like the whispers of long-forgotten ancestors carried on the wind. Rebecca and Mary watched, their eyes no longer those of schoolgirls. They seemed darker, deeper, as if Chiamaka could fall into them and never find her way out. "Do you like it?" Rebecca asked, her voice echoing strangely in Chiamaka's ears. Chiamaka nodded, unable to speak. Something was happening inside her. A warmth spread from her stomach, climbing up her spine like vines, tendrils of heat wrapping around her thoughts. Her head buzzed with a sound like 1,000 whispering voices. "Finish it," Mary commanded, her voice seeming to come from far away. As if in a trance, Chiamaka ate the entire chocolate. Each bite sent waves of that strange, ancient taste through her, building to a crescendo of sensation that threatened to overwhelm her. The school bell rang, its familiar tone distorted and alien. Chiamaka blinked, the world slowly coming back into focus. But something had changed. Forever. As she walked back to class, her steps faltered. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and ripple. The walls of the school building stretched and warped in her vision. And deep inside, in a place she had never known existed, something dark and hungry stirred to life. That night, an eerie stillness settled over the Adebayo home. Funmilayo was working late at her clinic, tending to the endless stream of patients that relied on her care. Adebayo was away on a business trip to Abuja, his voice reduced to occasional crackly phone calls and hastily typed messages. Chiamaka sat alone in the living room, the silence broken only by the scratch of her pencil on paper as she attempted to focus on her homework. But concentration eluded her. Her hands felt strange, alive with a tingling energy that seemed to dance just beneath her skin. The pencil moved. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the shadows cast by the dim lamp. But no, the pencil definitely moved. It slid across her notebook of its own accord, leaving behind marks that were not the neat rows of English or mathematics she had been working on. Strange symbols appeared on the page, curves and lines that hurt her eyes to look at directly. Words in a language she had never learned flowed from the pencil tip, telling stories of dark places and ancient powers. Chiamaka tried to stop it, to pull her hand away, but her body felt heavy and unresponsive. It was as if someone else was controlling her movements, using her hand as a conduit for messages she couldn't understand. Outside, the dog howled, long and mournful. The sound sent shivers down Chiamaka's spine, resonating with something new and terrifying that had taken root inside her. The temperature in the room plummeted. Goosebumps rose on Chiamaka's arms, and she could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and writhe, taking on shapes that vanished when she tried to look at them directly. The pencil continued its frenzied dance across the page, filling sheet after sheet with its arcane scrawlings. Chiamaka watched, helpless and fascinated, as the pile of covered papers grew beside her. When the pencil finally stilled, Chiamaka found herself drenched in sweat despite the cold. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see some visible sign of the strange power that had moved through her. But they looked the same as always, small and brown and ordinary. The papers, however, were far from ordinary. Chiamaka gathered them with trembling hands, her eyes skittering away from the unsettling symbols and words. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the unnatural cold, that something fundamental had changed. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, clutching the papers to her chest, Chiamaka felt eyes on her back. She turned, half expecting to see some monstrous shape looming in the shadows. But the living room was empty, the furniture silent sentinels in the gloom. Yet the feeling persisted. Watched. She was being watched. Chiamaka fled to her room, slamming the door behind her. But even as she huddled under her blankets, trying to convince herself that it had all been a dream, she knew. The chocolate had awakened something, and it was only the beginning. Midnight crept over Lagos like a stealthy predator, shadows lengthening and deepening until the city was swallowed by darkness. In Chiamaka's bedroom, the night pressed against the windows, as if trying to find a way in. At first glance, the room looked normal. Pink curtains fluttered in the breeze from the open window. School books were neatly arranged on the shelf, their spines a colorful parade of knowledge. A teddy bear sat on the bed, its button eyes reflecting pinpricks of moonlight. But Chiamaka was changing. It started with a tingling in her fingertips, a sensation that quickly spread up her arms and throughout her body. Her skin felt too tight, as if something inside her was pushing to get out. Then came the pain. Chiamaka bit down on her pillow to muffle her screams as her bones began to shift and reform. Her skin stretched and rippled, dark fur sprouting in waves across her body. Her face elongated, nose and mouth merging into a delicate muzzle. One moment, a terrified 12-year-old girl lay on the bed. The next, something else entirely occupied the space. A cat. But not just a cat. The creature that had been Chiamaka leapt gracefully to the floor, its movements too fluid, too purposeful for an ordinary feline. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence, reflecting a knowledge far beyond that of a simple animal. The cat that was not a cat padded silently around the room, its tail swishing with curiosity. It sniffed at the schoolbooks, pawed at the curtains, leapt onto the desk to examine the papers covered in strange symbols. As it moved, objects in the room seemed to respond to its presence. The curtains billowed despite the lack of wind. Books trembled on their shelves. The teddy bear's head turned, following the creature's progress. The cat paused, sitting in the center of the room. Its eyes, no longer Chiamaka's warm brown, but a deep, swirling gold, surveyed its domain. Power thrummed through its small body, a force as old as the earth itself. Waiting. It was waiting for something. Outside, the city slept on, unaware of the ancient magic that had awakened in its midst. But in Chiamaka's room, reality itself seemed to bend and warp around the feline figure. The night deepened, and with it, the transformation of Chiamaka Adebayo continued. Dawn broke over Lagos, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. But within the Adebayo home, shadows still lingered. Chiamaka moved through the house with an eerie grace. Her steps too quiet, her movements too precise for a 12-year-old girl. She paused at the foot of the stairs, head tilted as if listening to voices only she could hear. In the kitchen, Funmilayo rushed to prepare for another long day at the clinic. She barely glanced at her daughter as she gulped down her coffee, missing the strange, knowing look in Chiamaka's eyes. "Breakfast is on the table," Funmilayo said, grabbing her medical bag. She planted a quick kiss on Chiamaka's forehead, too harried to notice how her daughter flinched at the contact. The kiss felt cold, as if Chiamaka's skin had absorbed all warmth. "Have a good day at school, dear," Funmilayo called over her shoulder as she hurried out the door. Chiamaka smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was the smile of something ancient and patient, something that had waited centuries for this moment. As soon as the door closed behind her mother, the house changed. It started small. A cup on the kitchen counter slid an inch to the left, then another inch. No hand touched it. No wind moved it. It simply glided, as if the laws of physics had taken a holiday. In the living room, a book fell from the shelf. Then another. They opened by themselves, pages turning rapidly before stopping on specific passages. The words on these pages seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in time with some unheard rhythm. The curtains in the dining room began to sway, despite all the windows being firmly closed. Shadows in the corners deepened, taking on strange, shifting shapes that vanished when looked at directly. And through it all, Chiamaka stood in the center of the living room, her eyes closed, arms outstretched. She looked like a conductor before an orchestra, directing the symphony of impossible movements around her. When she opened her eyes, they were no longer the warm brown of Chiamaka Adebayo. They were pools of swirling darkness, reflecting knowledge and power no child should possess. A wind that wasn't wind whispered through the house, carrying fragments of ancient words and half-forgotten incantations. It swirled around Chiamaka, lifting her hair and making her school uniform billow like a cape. For a moment, just a moment, the ordinary suburban home in Lagos fell away. In its place stood something older, a place of power, a nexus of energies that had slumbered for millennia, now awakened by the innocence of a lonely child and the machinations of those who would use her. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The house settled back into its usual appearance. The books lay scattered on the floor. The cup sat innocently on the counter, a few inches from its original position. And Chiamaka, looking once again like an ordinary schoolgirl, picked up her bag and headed out the door. But the power lingered, unseen but felt. The house had become a vessel for something ancient and hungry, and it was growing stronger by the hour. Margaret's secondary school buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Children in crisp uniforms flooded through the gates, their chatter filling the air. But beneath the ordinary facade, something had changed. Chiamaka walked through the schoolyard, her movements fluid and purposeful. Other students instinctively moved out of her way, though if asked, they couldn't have explained why. There was something different about her, something that sent shivers down their spines. In the classroom, Rebecca and Mary watched Chiamaka from across the room. Their eyes, once merely calculating, now held a strange, feverish light. They didn't look like normal students anymore. There was an age to them, a weight of knowledge that didn't belong in young faces. During the morning lessons, Chiamaka sat quietly, her pen moving across her notebook. But she wasn't taking notes on the teacher's droning about long division. Instead, complex symbols and flowing script in an unknown language filled the pages, the ink seeming to shimmer and move in the fluorescent lighting. At break time, Rebecca and Mary approached Chiamaka in the schoolyard. The other children gave them a wide berth, instinctively sensing that something was not right with this trio. "How do you feel?" Rebecca asked, her voice low and eager. Chiamaka said nothing, but her smile was not her own. It was too wide, too knowing. Her eyes, when they met Rebecca's, held depths that made even the older girls step back. The older girls nodded to each other, a silent communication passing between them. They looked satisfied, as if Chiamaka had passed some unspoken test. "Another one," Mr. Okafor, the mathematics teacher, murmured. "We should do something." "You know we can't," Mrs. Adiemi, the headmistress, replied. Her voice was heavy with regret. "The consequences." They fell silent, watching as Rebecca and Mary led Chiamaka towards a secluded corner of the schoolyard. The air around the three girls seemed to shimmer, reality bending slightly in their wake. In that moment, St. Margaret's Secondary School stood revealed for what it truly was. Not just a place of learning, but a recruiting ground for forces beyond mortal understanding. A battleground where innocence was the prize and dark powers the victors. And Chiamaka, lonely, neglected Chiamaka, had just become their latest soldier. Night fell over Lagos, the city's usual cacophony of sounds muffled by an unnatural stillness. In the Adebayo home, tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Adebayo returned from his business trip, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his mind still churning with figures and contracts. He barely registered the chill that permeated the house, his tired brain dismissing it as an over-enthusiastic air conditioner. "Chiamaka?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the quiet house. "Funmalayo?" No answer came. Adebayo frowned, a tendril of unease worming its way into his gut. He made his way to the kitchen, intending to grab a cold drink before investigating further. That's when it happened. The knife block on the counter trembled. Adebayo blinked, sure he was seeing things, but no, it was definitely moving. As he watched, frozen in disbelief, the largest knife rose from its slot. It hung in the air for a moment, gleaming in the dim light. Then, slowly, it began to spin. Adebayo's breath caught in his throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by jet lag and stress. But the knife was joined by another, and another. Soon a half-dozen blades whirled in the air, their sharp edges glinting menacingly. "What in God's name?" Adebayo's words were cut short as he finally noticed the figure standing in the corner of the kitchen. Chiamaka. But not Chiamaka. His daughter stood unnaturally still, her feet hovering several inches above the ground. Her school uniform rippled as if blown by a strong wind, though the air in the kitchen was dead calm. "Chiamaka?" Adebayo's voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening? What's wrong with you?" Chiamaka's head turned towards him, the movement too smooth, too inhuman. Her eyes, when they met his, were solid black. No white, no warm brown irises, just endless, swirling darkness. The knives moved closer to Adebayo, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters. The points aimed directly at his chest. "Chiamaka, please," Adebayo pleaded, his back pressed against the refrigerator. "This isn't you. Whatever's happening, we can fix it. Just put the knives down." A sound came from Chiamaka's mouth, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, older, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "Chiamaka is ours now," the voices said. "And soon, you will be too." The knives inched closer, their points gleaming in the dim kitchen light. Adebayo felt his heart pounding in his chest, sweat beading on his forehead. He had faced tough negotiations, cutthroat business deals, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Facing his own daughter, transformed into something he couldn't comprehend. "Chiamaka," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, sweetheart, it's me. It's your father." For a moment, just a fleeting second, something flickered in those black eyes. A hint of recognition, a glimmer of the little girl who used to run to him with scraped knees and bedtime stories. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the darkness that had taken hold. The knives trembled, vibrating with barely contained energy. Adebayo closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, a loud crash echoed through the house. The front door burst open, wood splintering as it was forced off its hinges. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway, and a booming voice filled the air. "In the name of the Most High, I command you to stop." Pastor Chukwudi stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his imposing figure silhouetted against the hallway light. He was not what one might expect of a pastor. His muscular frame spoke of a man who battled more than just spiritual forces, and his eyes held a fierce determination that seemed almost at odds with his clerical collar. The knives clattered to the floor, the spell broken by the pastor's sudden arrival. Chiamaka, or the thing wearing Chiamaka's form, hissed, a sound no human throat should be able to produce. "Mr. Adebayo," Pastor Chukwudi said, his eyes never leaving Chiamaka. "Step away slowly. Come to me." Adebayo didn't need to be told twice. He inched along the wall, his legs trembling so badly he feared they might give out. When he reached the pastor's side, the older man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. What's happening?" Adebayo managed to choke out. "What's wrong with my daughter?" Pastor Chukwudi's face was grim. Something dark has taken hold of her, something ancient and evil, but all is not lost. There is still hope. The pastor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. With a practiced motion, he uncorked it and splashed some of the contents towards Chiamaka. The reaction was immediate and violent. Where the liquid touched her skin, it sizzled and steamed. Chiamaka, or the thing controlling her, let out an inhuman shriek. Her body contorted, twisting in ways that defied anatomy, and for a moment, Adebayo caught a glimpse of something else beneath his daughter's form. Something with too many limbs, too many eyes. "We don't have much time," Pastor Chukwudi said urgently. "Where is your wife?" As if in answer, they heard the sound of a key in the front door. Funmilayo's voice called out, confusion evident in her tone. "Adebayo, what happened to the door? Is everything all right?" "Funmilayo," Adebayo shouted. "Don't come in, it's not safe." But it was too late. Funmilayo appeared in the hallway, her medical bag still slung over her shoulder, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. Her husband and a strange man in the kitchen doorway, and beyond them, her daughter floating in midair, her eyes black as night. "Oh my God," Funmilayo whispered. "Chiamaka?" The thing that was not Chiamaka turned its head, fixing those bottomless black eyes on Funmilayo. A smile spread across its face, too wide, filled with too many teeth. "Mother," it said, in a voice that was a twisted parody of Chiamaka's. "You're just in time for dinner." Pastor Chukwudi moved with surprising speed for a man of his size. He grabbed Funmilayo and pulled her behind him, shielding both parents with his body. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What we face here is beyond your understanding. It is a darkness that has existed since the beginning of time, always seeking a way into our world, and it has chosen your daughter as its vessel." "But why?" Funmilayo asked, her voice choked with tears. "Why Chiamaka?" The pastor's eyes were filled with sorrow as he looked at them. "Because she was vulnerable, because she was alone. The darkness preys on the neglected, the forgotten. It offers power and belonging to those who feel they have neither." Adebayo and Funmilayo exchanged a look of dawning horror and guilt. How many times had they left Chiamaka alone? How many school events had they missed? How many dinners eaten in silence because they were too preoccupied with their own lives? "Can you save her?" Adebayo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Chukwudi nodded slowly. "I can try, but it will not be easy, and it will require sacrifice from all of us." Behind them, Chiamaka, or the thing wearing her form, began to laugh. It was a sound that sent chills down their spines, a sound of ancient malice and gleeful destruction. "You're too late," the voices said, echoing with inhuman glee. "The girl is ours, and soon, all of Lagos will follow." Pastor Chukwudi's face hardened. He reached into his bag and pulled out a worn leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age. "We'll see about that," he said grimly. "The night is long, but faith is stronger, and I intend to see the dawn." As he began to chant in a language none of them recognized, the air in the kitchen grew heavy with power. The battle for Chiamaka's soul, and perhaps the soul of the city itself, was about to begin. The Adebayo home, once a haven of suburban tranquility, had become a battleground. The air crackled with unseen energies, making hair stand on end and skin prickle with goosebumps. In the kitchen, a tableau of the impossible unfolded. Chiamaka, or the thing wearing her form, hovered in the center of the room, dark energy swirling around her like a malevolent storm. Furniture rattled and shook. Dishes flew from cupboards to shatter against walls, and the very foundations of the house groaned under the strain of containing such otherworldly power. Pastor Chukwudi stood firm, his weathered Bible open in one hand, the other raised in a gesture of both supplication and command. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the room with words of power. Not just prayers, but ancient incantations that predated Christianity, calling upon forces as old as creation itself. By the power of the Most High, by the ancient covenants, by the names unspoken since the world was young, I command you, the pastor's voice boomed. Release this child. The thing wearing Chiamaka's form laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. Your God has no power here, old man. We are legion. We are eternal. We are. Its words were cut off as Pastor Chukwudi flung a handful of herbs into the air. The dried leaves ignited mid-flight, filling the room with pungent smoke. Chiamaka's body convulsed, a shriek of pain and rage tearing from her throat. Adebayo and Funmalayo huddled in the corner, clinging to each other. They watched in horror and awe as the battle for their daughter's soul raged before them. What can we do? Funmalayo whispered, her doctor's instincts warring with the impossible reality before her. How can we help? Pastor Chukwudi spared them a glance, his eyes fierce with concentration. Pray, he said. Pray like you've never prayed before, and remember your love for your daughter. That love is the strongest weapon we have. As if in response to his words, the darkness surrounding Chiamaka intensified. Shadows peeled themselves from the walls, taking on monstrous shapes. They lunged at Pastor Chukwudi, claws of pure darkness raking at his flesh. The pastor stood his ground, chanting louder. Light began to emanate from him, pushing back the shadows. But it was clear the effort was taking its toll. Sweat poured down his face, and his hands trembled as he held the Bible aloft. You cannot win, the voices speaking through Chiamaka hissed. We have taken root in this child's heart. Her loneliness, her pain, her neglect, they opened the door for us, and now we will never let her go. Adebayo felt each word like a physical blow. Memories flashed through his mind, missed school plays, forgotten birthdays, dinners eaten in silence while he focused on work emails. How had he not seen the pain in his daughter's eyes? How had he let it come to this? Chiamaka, he called out, his voice breaking. Chiamaka, we're here. We love you. Please, come back to us. For a moment, just a heartbeat. The swirling darkness faltered. Chiamaka's eyes, black as pitch, flickered. For an instant, Adebayo saw his daughter looking at him, scared and confused. Daddy, her voice, her real voice, whispered. Then the moment passed. The darkness surged back, stronger than ever. Chiamaka's body arched backwards, mouth open in a silent scream as the possessing forces reasserted their control. Foolish humans, the voices growled. Your love is weak. Your faith is a candle in a hurricane. We are the night that will swallow your world. We are. Enough. Pastor Chukwudi's voice cut through the cacophony like a blade. He stepped forward, his Bible held high. I name you, spirits of darkness. I bind you by the power of light. I cast you out by the authority granted to me by the Most High. The pastor began to recite, not in any language Adebayo or Funmalayo recognized, but in words that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. The air shimmered, reality itself seeming to bend and warp around them. Chiamaka's body thrashed and convulsed, the darkness swirling around her like a maelstrom. Objects flew through the air, smashing against walls and narrowly missing the huddled parents. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the windows despite the Lagos heat. And through it all, Pastor Chukwudi's voice never faltered. He advanced step by step, his words a shield and a sword against the encroaching darkness. The battle raged on, the fate of Chiamaka's soul, and perhaps the fate of Lagos itself, hanging in the balance. As the night deepened, the Adebayo home became the epicenter of a spiritual war that would determine the course of events for years to come. The kitchen of the Adebayo home had become a nexus of cosmic forces, a battleground where the fate of not just Chiamaka, but potentially all of Lagos hung in the balance. Pastor Chukwudi stood at the center of the maelstrom, his white robe billowing in winds that shouldn't exist indoors, his eyes blazing with an inner light that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. "In the name of all that is holy," the pastor intoned, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of faith, "I command you, spirits of darkness, to release this child." The thing wearing Chiamaka's form writhed in midair, its movements jerky and unnatural. Black smoke poured from her mouth and eyes, coalescing into shapes that defied description. Tentacles, claws, faces twisted in eternal agony. "We are legion," the voices hissed, a cacophony of whispers and screams. "We are eternal. We cannot be banished by your pitiful faith." But even as the words were spoken, something changed. The temperature in the room, which had plummeted to Arctic levels, began to rise. The frost on the windows receded, melting away as if touched by an unseen sun. Pastor Chukwudi's eyes narrowed. He could feel it, a weakening in the dark forces' hold, a crack in their seemingly impenetrable armor. "You lie," he said, his voice calm but filled with unshakable certainty. "You can be banished. You have been before, and you will be again. By the power vested in me, by the faith of generations, by the love of this child's parents, I cast you out." He flung his arms wide, and a wave of pure light erupted from his body. It washed over Chiamaka, and for a moment her true self shone through, scared, confused, but undeniably there. "Mom? Dad?" Her voice, small and frightened, cut through the chaos. "Help me, please." Adebayo and Funmilayo, who had been watching in terrified awe, felt something stir within them, a fierce, primal love that transcended fear, that burned away doubt and hesitation. "We're here, Chiamaka," Funmilayo called out, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "We love you. Fight them, baby. Come back to us." Adebayo joined in, his deep voice cracking with emotion. "You're stronger than them, Chiamaka. You always have been. We believe in you." Their words seemed to have a physical effect. The darkness surrounding Chiamaka recoiled as if burned by the simple, powerful truth of parental love. But the battle was far from over. The possessing spirits rallied, their fury palpable in the air. "Fools," they roared. "Your love is nothing compared to our power. We will devour you all." The darkness surged forward, a tidal wave of malevolent energy aimed directly at Pastor Chukwudi. For a moment it seemed as if he would be overwhelmed, swallowed by the encroaching night. But the pastor stood firm. He raised his Bible high, and it began to glow with an inner light. Words appeared on its pages, not in any earthly language, but in scripts that predated human civilization. "I call upon the ancient covenants," Pastor Chukwudi declared. "I invoke the names that were old when the world was young. By the power of light, by the strength of faith, by the bonds of love, I command you, be gone." A blast of pure white light erupted from the Bible, so bright that Adebayo and Funmilayo had to shield their eyes. It collided with the wave of darkness in a spectacular explosion of energy that shook the very foundations of the house. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, light and darkness struggled for dominance. The air itself seemed to warp and bend, reality straining under the weight of forces beyond mortal comprehension. And then, with a sound like 1,000 thunderclaps, the darkness shattered. Chiamaka's body fell to the ground, the unnatural levitation finally broken. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the house dissipated, replaced by a feeling of lightness, of a great weight being lifted. Pastor Chukwudi stumbled, suddenly looking every one of his years. The Bible in his hands smoked slightly, its pages blank once more. "It is done," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The spirits are banished, but the fight is not over yet." Adebayo and Funmilayo rushed to their daughter's side. Chiamaka lay still, her breathing shallow, her skin pale and clammy. "Chiamaka?" Funmilayo called softly, cradling her daughter's head in her lap. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" Slowly, painfully, Chiamaka's eyes fluttered open. They were her own eyes again, warm brown and filled with confusion and fear. "Mom, Dad?" she whispered. What happened? I had such terrible dreams." Adebayo gathered his family in his arms, tears flowing freely down his face. "It's okay now, Chiamaka. You're safe. We're here, and we're never leaving you alone again." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the Adebayo family huddled together on the kitchen floor, battered but unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But as Pastor Chukwudi had said, the fight was far from over. The real battle, The battle to heal the wounds that had allowed the darkness to take root in the first place was just beginning.